greatness can frequently come through adversity. When it comes to creative endeavours like making television, the idea that creativity can flourish in an atmosphere of pressure and a circumstance where everything is against you, it's a powerful and an interesting one. The idea that it's what brings out the best in the creative in order to perhaps prove a point in a way. And indeed to point to situations where this has been the case. Probably the most popular film of all time is the original Star Wars, which was hell to conceive, develop, and make pretty much from start to finish, yet completely redefined an entire genre and probably the medium of cinema as a whole. Adversity created greatness. And yet, when it comes to its cheaper British relative, it's difficult to think of any scenarios in which Doctor Who truly has flourished through adversity. Some absolutely excellent episodes face significant scripting problems, for sure. The reason The War Games is 10 episodes is because the story had to fill a gap in the season because literally nothing else was available to fill it. But in terms of a Star Wars where conceiving, writing, and producing are all beset by enormous problems that nevertheless led to a classic, I see very few examples. The Invasion of Time is a story beset by absolutely enormous problems. Season 15 had been one of transition, with the powers that be having replaced Philip Hinchcliffe with Graham Williams after season 14, and Robert Holmes only staying on long enough in this season to smooth the transition over. The season as a whole is okay. A couple of great stories and some less great ones, but it was clear almost immediately the handing over to an inexperienced production team as they were, coming from the show's golden years no less, was not working out flawlessly. Once the leftovers from the Gothic era and the story penned by Robert Holmes, who could pull quality Doctor Who out of his arse on a whim and needed no help to do so, are taken out, you get The Invisible Enemy, yeah, and Underworld, double yeah. So little real surprise that they were encountering problems with a finale for this season as well. It's been invariably reported that the planned finale was to feature cat people, and the script was allowed to get out of control to the point where it had been completely impossible to realise, even on a budget significantly higher than what Doctor Who usually had. And as we'll find out shortly, it didn't even have what it usually had at this point. The whole thing therefore had to be binned, and Williams and script editor Anthony Reid had to lock themselves in the office and write out a script as quickly as possible. The story goes out under the pseudonym David Agnew, which would later be reused for City of Death, which was produced when the script became unworkable and the producer and script editor had to lock themselves in the office and write out a script as quickly as possible. Clearly lessons are never really learned. City of Death, of course, ended up as one of the series' all-time classics, so that's not to say that this particular strand of adversity can't create greatness, but there are true reasons that happened then and not for this story. Firstly, Douglas Adams already had David Fisher's concept to work with, which got rid of the coming up with ideas bit, which can often be a major issue, and secondly, City of Death went pretty smoothly once the script was done, which was not the case here. In case you were unaware, the British economy in the mid to late 1970s was not very good, and in 1977-78 it was at its most not very good. This meant that money was not exactly in abundance at the BBC, and rampant inflation meant that what Doctor Who had in budget at the start of the season was significantly reduced by its end. This was not helped by Williams' inexperience, which meant he overspent on the special effects for the Invisible Enemy, which further emptied the coffers. This led to the infamous use of the very unconvincing combination of miniature sets and CSO for Underworld, because they literally couldn't even afford to put enough sets together to make the story, which was a luxury they could only have dreamed of for this story because there was even less money than that. Making matters worse, along with a bad economy, industrial relations were also very bad, and the story was further crippled by strikes among various BBC departments, which meant the little money they could spend would not be very effectively used. The combination of these issues meant the only thing the production team could do was dig out the stored sets and props from the Deadly Assassin and return to Gallifrey. Not because they had a great idea they wanted to do, returning to Gallifrey, you understand, because they had basically no other choice. And well, we had the Sontaran costumes in store as well, why not bring them back too? The final issue they had was more of a self-inflicted one, that Louise Jameson had declared her intention to leave the series, but the producers thought that she was bluffing and decided to write a lame toss-off departure that could be easily changed at the last minute when she changed her mind. Except she didn't change her mind, and she ended up leaving on one of the least satisfying companion departures of all time. So, as I said, that wound was self-inflicted at least. In any case, of all these things against it, it comes very little surprise that the Invasion of Time is not very good, although it's frankly a miracle it was even watchable given all of that, so you have to take it as it is in a way. The thing is about the story is that while it is quite bad, you'll hear no objection to that from me. This is a really fascinating story, because the adjective I've used to describe it most of all isn't bad, it's bizarre. This is one of the weirdest stories of its time. In many ways, that's a bad weird. Strange portrayal of Gallifrey, poor plotting, padding to the roof. But in a lot of ways, it gives the story a lot of memorable moments, quotable dialogue, and, well, a lot of so bad it's good moments. This isn't highlight so bad it's good Who. Nothing will ever dethrone Dragonfire from that podium, but it's not far off by any stretch of the imagination. First, we'll take a look at production, and there's more to say than usual this time, around because of how the production was invariably shaped by the issues I discussed. The director of the story was Gerald Blake. This was his second story. His first? Well, in keeping with the bizarreness females on about, it was The Abominable Snowman, which was a mere 10 seasons before. Why this one director was brought back after 10 years only to never come back again is not something I can answer, but there we are. In fact, it is reported that he attempted to rein in Tom Baker's on-set behaviour by saying that, "I remember when you were Patrick Troughton." I say attempted because I find it difficult to imagine why Baker would have given a shit, but there we are. It's funny that the directing itself is probably the least interesting part of this entire story, as it's a pretty bang average job for the era. There's nothing that stands out particularly, but nothing that isn't a huge detriment either, so we'll call it a wash there. I'll say that some of the staging of some moments aren't particularly impressive, especially in the TARDIS chase in part 6, where it all starts to get a bit Scooby-Doo, but in Blake's defense it was all a bit Scooby-Doo in the script, and I'm not sure how he could have prevented it from coming across that way on screen. Conversely, there's a lot of editing decisions that I really think work quite well, and add a certain gravitas to certain scenes that wasn't really there on the page, so yeah. Pretty fine, really. Not much to say about this, especially when there's a lot to say about the rest of the production. Due to the aforementioned strike, some of the studio sessions were lost, which forced the production team to fill in using location shooting. This is why the TARDIS interior looks like some random building's interior, because that's what it is. Now, this is a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it looks cheap and tossed off, and it doesn't help that the script ran out of steam a long time ago by this point, and most of the episode is just the Doctor and co walking around this incredibly cheap-looking set, made all the worse by the fact that because it's on location, it's on film, which gives it the distinct outside look that film did as opposed to videotape, which does in its own way make it look even more cheap and fake. On the other hand, though, I do actually quite like the idea of the TARDIS as being a bit idiosyncratic and odd. In the JNT era, the further TARDIS interiors would look exactly like the control room, which made it all feel a bit uniform and predictable, and I think that the Doctor's TARDIS should have a bit of character to it. Now, the character provided here is very much the crap and cheap variety, as I said, but nevertheless gives a bit of life and makes the TARDIS feel like as dynamic and unpredictable as it should. And well, why wouldn't the TARDIS main power generator, whatever it was, be in a dank corridor disguised as an art gallery? And that fits for me. I'll also discuss the rest of the sets because, well, I just reused ones from the Deadly Assassin, as I mentioned. Those are brilliant sets then, and they certainly retain a lot of what made them effective, but the lighting job is far, far less effective than it was here. While in that story it was dark, moody, and atmospheric, here it's just lit, flat, and bright. Now, whether this was the lighting people not being as good, or whether it was simply a product of the circumstances under which the story was made, I couldn't say, but it doesn't mean that they simply don't look as good. The Panopticon looks incredible in the Deadly Assassin, here it looks good. It looks good because it's a fantastic set, even when lit badly, but it lacks that atmospheric edge that it had there. It's a shame because there couldn't be a better story to reuse sets from, and yet they sadly do lack the effectiveness they had there. The special effects of the story are also fairly notorious for being bad, the Vardens famously being described as a tinfoil monster. While it doesn't look good, I'm willing to cut them a bit of slack on this. Firstly, because it's understandable it looks like that given they had no money, and secondly, that even with the money, the effects at the time probably wouldn't have produced much better for a nebulous amorphous monster like that. It does look like tinfoil, yes, but overall for me personally it doesn't detract as much as it might do for others. On the other hand, there's the Sontarans. For me, I don't think there's ever been a makeup job that has quite hit right for the Sontarans, even the original. I think there's a look that has never quite been captured for them. This doesn't get anywhere close, man. This is probably the worst one of the lot. He looks like he's got eyeliner on, for God's sake. I'm generally not huge on the use of the Sontarans in the story anyway, but looking at them like that doesn't help, to put it mildly. Finally, on the production side, I want to briefly touch on Dudley Simpson's music. It's mostly just his standard generic fare, while not impressive, is inoffensive as ever. There are a few good moments, the Sontaran theme is quite good, but otherwise it's pretty average. But there is one thing I want to touch on, that it's a shame for me that his absolutely brilliant organ pieces for the Deadly Assassin are replicated here, but to a much lower standard. While the pieces for that story were thrilling, atmospheric, and helped the tension brilliantly, here the organ pieces sound a bit like the intro to an instructional video made in the early 90s. The kind of music from The Deadly Assassin would have added a tense edge to the scenes of the Doctor's investiture as president, for instance, but as is, it just sort of reinforces the whole tone of this thing as a bit of a farce. Like, we can't even get the scary organ music right anymore. That, I think, is indicative of the problem the whole story faces. Everything is a step down, even to the smallest things. When it comes to the script, it is, as I mentioned, a pretty bizarre one, but what's odd is that this doesn't come from just one or two aspects, but permeates pretty much the entire thing. Let's start with the overall premise and plot, because it's obviously one of the most bizarre and half-baked plots the series has ever had. The Doctor needs to go and take his rightful place as president of Gallifrey, something we never got from the end of the Deadly Assassin, but never mind, in order to allow the Vardens to take over Gallifrey so he can defeat them. It's a convoluted idea that never really comes across effectively as to, why the Doctor is going to such enormous trouble and risk and to defeat these D-tier villains. People are killed because of this plan, something which goes unremarked upon, and everyone acts as if the Doctor has saved everyone in a heroic fashion when it's his fault any of this started in the first place. Now, If the Vardans could threaten Gallifrey, and therefore the only hope the Doctor has of stopping them conquering the planet is to work with them like this, it would make a bit more sense, but this is never communicated in any real way, and also begs the question of how these useless shimmers of light are so powerful as to be a serious threat to the Time Lords. Remember, even in The Deadly Assassin, which had shattered much of their godlike invulnerability, they were still clearly far above most of the rest of the universe. But in any case, the numbers just don't add up. Why is the Doctor going to such utterly absurd lengths to defeat the Vardans? A question which is key to the entire plot and is never given a satisfactory answer. The premise is confusingly lackluster then, but don't worry, it leads to a half-baked plot, so that's alright. Now, the plot certainly has its moments. Watching the Doctor be in evil mode and slowly take over is satisfying, but seeing how quickly Gallifrey falls to this personality-driven authoritarianism, it rings quite true these days. Ultimately, though, it's let down by a few things. Firstly, Oa is so very padded, and leads these to a wandering feeling throughout much of the story, like we're going nowhere and not being very fast about it. This means the pacing feels particularly poor, and while there are moments that impress, the Doctor's reveal of the Vardans and evil laugh at the end of Part 2, for instance, it means that immediately we go back to slowly talking about things and grumbling, which takes up a fair chunk of the running time of this story. Secondly, it frequently struggles with pointless additions to the story that go absolutely nowhere. The whole Savages plot is completely half-baked and adds basically nothing, and well, if you ask me, the Sontarans' entire appearance falls into that category, but we'll get to that. And thirdly, a lot of it just lacks any drive or energy. It's confusedly wandering through its running time. This is particularly a problem in parts 5 and 6, where what had worked about a story disappeared, and we fell into the Sontarans chase everyone, which gets old after about 5 minutes, but basically takes up the whole rest of the story. There are strengths to it, definitely. It builds up a quite good sense of mystery and takes the right moments to reveal what the Doctor's plans and motivations truly are. Seeing the Doctor act so alien is very much a strength, and the story is wise in how it presents it. Watching the Doctor's plans slowly come together works quite well until we reach the story's biggest problem. This plot ends in part 4, and the rug pull reveal of the Sontarans means we've run out of interesting stuff to do with it, and that's probably what leads to parts 5 and 6 being more like an episode of Scooby-Doo than anything else. Before we get to the Sontaran stuff though, obviously the reason I'm even doing this story is because of the whole look at the show's lore and the history of Gallifrey. And obviously as the sequel to The Deadly Assassin, you'd expect it to fall into that category reasonably well. Well, no, not especially. It in fact raises more questions than it answers, not in a good way. A lot of the plot revolves around the key of Rassilon, which is sort of indicative of the approach taken in this story. First of all, its use here directly contradicts that story, the key here being presented as a lost artifact, which was not the case then. But its use of it is even more bizarre. Apparently this great key is so powerful it can power the ridiculous MacGuffin gun, and no president can ever know about it. But the Chancellor, a lesser position in Gallifreyan hierarchy, not only knows about it, but is the protector of it. Eh? So this lower down position can be trusted with it, but not the person who's been chosen to lead the whole of the Time Lords. Oh, and we know later on Barusa, the incumbent Chancellor in this story, does become president, so what happens then? Is there an amnesia ray used so the president always forgets? It's very demonstrative the approach the story takes, and it seems to have no real interest in actually exploring Gallifrey and the Time Lords and their history, just using the backdrop to fit the plot as it is. The Invasion of Time therefore adds very little to the overall lore of the series in Gallifrey precisely because of this. It has no real interest in doing so. Let the DMAC gun, or whatever the fuck it was called, the BFG the Doctor uses at the end of the story. Everyone acts like a silly looking gun, which I'm fairly sure is a reused prop from something else. It's just like the most dangerous weapon of all time and a power shouldn't be used, and it's just a bloody big-ass gun. There's no thought to what it means for the history of the Doctor or his people, no thematic importance or anything like that, just this big gun is bad. It's understandable, I suppose, given the circumstances in which the story was written, but on the other hand, if you weren't going to use Gallifrey properly, then why at all? Were they the only sets you had in storage? Even more indicative of this approach is the Sontarans, added apparently because Graham Williams liked them, and, well, they had the costumes in storage and Neville didn't have to pay for new ones. But what were you planning to do with the Sontarans? Say anything about them? Do anything with them? Nothing. They're just generic baddies here who want to conquer Gallifrey for power. And frankly, the power disparity that should exist here between the Time Lords and the Sontarans is frankly unbelievable from my point of view. The Sontarans should not be powerful enough to threaten Gallifrey, I'm sorry, but that flies completely against everything we had learned about both species. I'm willing to accept the Sontarans are pretty advanced. After all, in their first story they did have some limited time travel, but there are limits to that. In any case, back to the original point, the Sontarans had nothing here. We learn nothing about them. All the Head One does is repeat stuff we already knew about them being clones and stuff, and all they do is smash stuff up and chase our heroes around like, well, an episode of Scooby-Doo, as I've said. Their relationship with the Vardans is ill-defined. They just use them for their purpose and other generic baddie stuff. Again, very indicative of the approach. They just use them, don't bother how or why, it's not important, doesn't matter. Except, when doing proper storytelling, it should. I'm also probably the only person on Earth who doesn't really like the cliffhanger to part 4 where the Sontarans suddenly appear. I mean, as I said earlier, the music is very good and adds to the atmosphere enormously, and it is suddenly effective in the moment, sure, but it's an arse pull like no other, given there's not been a single indication of this. It's just throwing something unexpected at the audience and seeing what sticks. The build up is kind of awkward and doesn't set the mood right. The lame celebrating acting is particularly silly, and well, what's the payoff? As I said, not very much. As for the Vardens, well, they have silly voices and spend most of the story as bits of tinfoil. They really are just the most generic baddies possible. If you think there's much to say about them, they are generics. So, not enormously impressive so far, it has to be said, but frankly there are some good bits that do liven up the story a bit. Even those do come with big asterisks, mind, but nevertheless there are some bits that work. The Doctor's character is done very uniquely in this story, by showing him acting in such a mysterious and even hostile way. It is a genuine question to the audience as to what's going on. As said earlier, it's an effective mystery, whether the Doctor really is bad now, whether his mind has been diddled with, or as we eventually find out, he's playing along. It's very open in the early stages of the story, which definitely works. But it is explained as we go along. We aren't left in the dark for too long, and doesn't allow it to become confusing. Compare it to parts 5 to 8 of The Trial of a Time Lord, where the Doctor's behaviour is and remains confusing throughout, and this goes at the right pace in this story and therefore works. Also, Tom Baker's performance is absolutely fantastic. He does the strange evasiveness perfectly, really adding an even further layer of intrigue to what's going on, as it's just impossible to read the performance to find out. Intentionally, of course, Baker is hiding the truth just as much as the Doctor is. When he loses his cool a few times and shouts at hapless Time Lords, Baker really sells just how much pressure the Doctor is under. Initially it seems as if he's angry and hostile and being weird without clear reason, and this enhances the feeling of alienation surrounding his presentation, but later on we can clearly see it's a frustration with having to constantly guard his mind from the Varden telepathy boiling over. It also works because of his interactions with other characters, and there are some highlights here. Barusa is a central character of the story after being a secondary one in The Deadly Assassin. His previous actor was unavailable, so John Arnott fills the void, and while he lacks the previous statesman-like bombacity and total air of authority, he makes up for it in the quieter scenes which needed to be effective to make this character dynamic work. The story follows on from The Deadly Assassin is that Barusa is perplexed and frustrated by the Doctor and his methods, but ultimately believes that despite the vulgarity of how he acts, he is brilliant and he was right to see the potential in him. Arnott does very well in portraying the boiling frustration Barusa has with the Doctor, and not being able to read what's going on and therefore wondering whether this faith in the Doctor was right for him to hold or not. My pick for the best scene in the story is when the Doctor reveals all to Barusa once the lead lining is in place to protect their minds from being read. It's edited to carefully reveal the information rather than just being straight exposition, which I like, but also has a great deal for character. Barusa realises that the Doctor did indeed have a plan, but also realises how the Doctor has surpassed him. Arnott's subtle performance is brilliant here, as he realises that not only was the Doctor on the right track, he has also in many ways become his superior. Barusa's realisation that the Vardens would have been able to read him like a book is absolutely brilliant. This master-student relationship is very well handled, and despite Barusa's pomposity, shows him to nevertheless have a more subtle and softer side, maybe in like the vein of the first Doctor perhaps. I cannot emphasise enough how much I think it was an enormous mistake by the JNT era production teams to make him into a villain as they did, because it lost this excellent relationship with the Doctor that had so much potential that should have been realised. You could have chosen any old Time Lord to be the villain in the Five Doctors, why this one? It doesn't however detract from the positives of these character interactions in this story. Also successful is the Doctor's relationship with Leela. Now, her character as a whole is very much something for another day, but her relationship with the Doctor in this story is very much something that had not been explored before with her, and therefore takes this last opportunity to do so. Leela in this story is essentially being put into the role Jamie had in The Evil of the Daleks, that of the companion being confused and angry at the Doctor's strange behaviour, but with two important differences. Firstly, Jamie did not know what the Doctor was up to, only the audience did, whereas here we start out just as much in the dark as Leela is, and only learn things at a slightly faster rate than she does. This heightens the feeling of alienation and confusion that Leela has, that her reaction to the Doctor's strange behaviour feels perfectly understandable given what's happening. Secondly, Leela reacts differently. Jamie's patience and faith eventually snapped, but Leela remains loyal to the Doctor throughout, and her faith in him never disappears, and works perfectly with her character. The Doctor has mentored and taught her, but he's always been an eccentric and weirdo from her point of view. Him being a bit more strange isn't going to break that faith. It's a great way of showing the relationship these two built up, and indeed putting a cap on it. It's less effective than it more or less pooters out the end of part 4 when we get Scoob and Shaggy instead, but never mind. Even less effective than that is her departure. As previously mentioned, the production team did not think Louise Jameson would actually leave, and therefore wrote her an easily reversible ending for when she inevitably changed her mind. Except she didn't, and they were stuck with it, where she declares her love for Andred and stays behind. Now, she says about 4 conversations with Andred in the whole story, and while Jameson and Chris Tranchell do their best to try and add some chemistry, it's just not there on the page and they don't have anything to work with. It just feels extremely forced. Now, I don't actually mind the idea of Leela falling in love with a Time Lord as she does. It sort of caps her arc of being intelligent and capable, and her environment she grew up in being responsible for how she is. It's not out of the question, I don't think. And indeed, even if they wanted something easy to reverse, it should have been pretty obvious that putting more interactions and chemistry in still could have paid off, either by setting up a future encounter or just having the old companion fell in love by but didn't stay routine. God knows it wouldn't have been very successful, most likely like the crap romance in Planet of the Daleks, but it would have been something, where here there isn't even something. But this particular element of the story has been discussed to death over the years, there's a little point in me repeating these things. The character of Andred as a whole is in many ways an exercise in frustration, even ignoring that. The idea of this guard who is nevertheless opinionated yet capable was a good one, but it's nevertheless falls flat for a few reasons. Most of this is only really explored in his crap revolution that goes nowhere, which has ended up with a brief conversation with the Doctor and does not exactly display his organisational skills, to put it mildly. After that, he just becomes Sergeant generic, and that puts a cap on that. It shows the approach the story has that I've commented on time and again that it just doesn't really seem interested in developing its ideas. I mean, unsurprising given the circumstances in which the script was written, but still disappointing. As for the other characters, most of them don't matter beyond their one-sentence descriptions. Rodan is noticeable as giving the story the one thing it had that the Deadly Assassin does not. A female character, the first female Time Lord in fact. She's often spoken of as the prototype for Romana, the book-spark yet inexperienced thing. It's a clear point of comparison. However, Rodan is a bit of a wet blanket and Romana ended up being confident and headstrong. The idea is clearly born here despite the differences though. Nobody else really matters, apart from one character, Castellan Kellner, who's such a wonderfully slimy character. Slimy, selfish, conniving arsehole. Now, the character is little more than that on the page, with his self-preservation instinct being almost farcical at times, but so much life is breathed into him by Milton John's wonderfully despicable performance. He really becomes a character you love to hate, and so much of that is John's. I recently rewatched The Enemy of the World, and he gives a similar performance there as Bennick. It's an unfortunate bit of typecasting as a slimy weasel, but he's nevertheless really good at it, and he repeats that here. The general presentation of the story continues the fairly bizarre theme of all this. Well, in part, there are some good things about it. The dialogue is quite sharp throughout, it always feels witty and natural, and certainly quite clever. Kellner's pathetic toadying, for instance, is intentionally over the top and amusing because of that. Also, K9 gets some particularly good barbs, at the expense of Leela and Andred, but this also includes probably my favourite K9 scene of all time.
Where is the Doctor? Speak! You are a very stupid machine.
It's just such a bizarre and out of nowhere scene, and it kind of speaks to the approach and what makes the story a contender for the so bad is good category. It just seems so out of nowhere bizarre a lot of the time. Sometimes in a funny way, like that K9 bit, or there's nothing more useless than a lock with a voice imprint. These are the kind of hilariously out of place things that give the story so much of that feeling. But then, sometimes it's just flat out weird and annoying, like most of the Scooby-Doo chase in Part 6, which gets old so quickly, as I've mentioned a million times already. The Sontaran getting eaten by the giant plant is a particular lowlight there. So, all in all, it's a mixed bag in this regard, which is a feeling enhanced by some of the more random moments throughout, which are clearly caused by the need to have conveniences in the quickly done script. What this does mean is that despite mostly being unimpressive, the story does manage to always be memorable. Whether that's through good character interactions, bizarre moments like the lock with a voice imprint, or cringy and stupid shenanigans with the Sontaran chase, it's never a story that feels generic or dull. There's plenty of unimpressive who, but you'll never mistake the story for another one. So, to answer the 2 questions I sort of posed at the beginning of the review, first of all, is this story so bad it's good? As a whole, probably not, I'd say. Mostly because it's too inconsistent to really hold that feeling throughout. Unlike, say, Dragonfire, which is balls out insanity from start to finish. There's a lot that's so good it's good, and a lot that's so bad it's bad. It's not a case you can say it for the whole thing. It has a lot of so bad it's good moments, though, and a general feeling throughout which certainly can be amusing in how bizarre it can be. It has its moments in that category, definitely, but I'm not sure it manages it as an overall story. As for whether greatness came out of adversity, no. Whatever good is here was not demonstrably a product of pressure, just a few bits of smart writing, and it's clear the script and production deficiencies a result from simply not enough time or money were a major drawback. Adversely was probably why the end product was so disappointing. It makes the end result understandable, but nevertheless unimpressive. So I'm going to award this story a final score of 3 out of 10. Has its moments for sure, it's never boring or offensively bad, and it has sharp dialogue and a few good moments, but it suffers from being all over the place, poorly plotted, forced out, and being poorly paced as well. It's frequently amusing, occasionally interesting, and certainly never dull, but rarely particularly impressive. It's funny that this video is supposed to be part of the series that looks at the lore and history of the Time Lords, but this story adds so little of consequence, there's basically nothing to really talk about. The Savages, for instance, nothing is done with that at all. The idea of the Time Lords abandoning their society goes completely unexplored. Nothing's ever done with it again in the classic series, and why would it be? It's not exploring the lore and history of the series, just putting things in because they can. Ultimately, it's a disappointment purely because it seems uninterested in exploring its own ideas, and, well, we end up with what we have on the screen. It's cheap, and it's not interesting enough to make up for it.